You're listening to Dodge Movie Podcast. Your hosts are Christy and Mike Dodge, the founders of Dodge Media Productions. We produce films and podcasts, so this is a podcast about films. Join them as they share their passion for filmmaking.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Dodge Movie Podcast. This is episode 117, and we are talking about 1985's Into the Night. And we are again welcoming Dustin Morrow and Lisa Molinelli to help us break this movie down and talk about it. Please listen to last week's episode so that you get the hint for the month, as well as you get to hear about Dustin and Lisa and their accomplishments. There are many accomplishments. The director is John Landis, who also did in 1980 Blues Brothers, 83 Twilight Zone, 86 a big hit for Mike and I, Three Amigos, and 88 Coming to America. It stars Jeff Goldblum, Michelle Pfeiffer, Dan Aykroyd, and a bunch of cameos. The DP was Robert Painter, who in 81 did American Werewolf in London. In 83, Trading Places. 84, A Departure with Muppets Take Manhattan. And also in 83, he shot the Thriller video.
How do you like
all of
Muppets?
that Landis? All of that was John Landis.
Yes, yeah. So obviously they have a relationship.
Yeah.
The writer is Ron Koslow, and I don't have anything listed, so I don't know what his previous...
Ron Koslow was also, like last week's episode, like a young, I think he might have even been a film student when he wrote this, but he went on to create the show Beauty and the Beast with Linda Hamilton and Ron Perlman.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and he did another show that after that was a huge hit. Psych, maybe it was him.
Oh,
I can't
wow.
remember. There was something else that he did that he became a TV guy, essentially.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The synopsis for this film is after discovering that his wife is cheating on him, an insomniac aerospace engineer accidentally meets and tries to help a beautiful model on the run from some extremely dangerous people. Ed Oken used to have a boring life. Then one night he met Diana. Now Ed's having trouble staying alive. That's
A little wordy, but
Yeah,
it kind of
it's a
gets you where
little
you need to go.
And then it says a dangerous comedy. And then, here we go. And then the other one, this was common,
It's
I feel.
a dangerous romance.
Yeah.
That's what they call it.
Oh.
Yeah, it says it right on the poster. A dangerous romance.
Wow. Oh, that's
Yeah,
the
which
next
is
one
much
after.
better than dangerous comedy.
Yes. Yes. And then very common, I feel like in the 80s, from John Landis, the maker of Blues Brothers and American Werewolf in London and Trading Places.
In the
Appeal to
world.
authority.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so Mike, why don't you kick us off with your pickup line?
You want some coffee? And that's from his wife, which is interesting that since he's an insomniac, and you associate coffee with caffeine and keeping you awake. So
But it looks like they're at their morning breakfast.
they are
meal,
at the morning, yeah.
and they're starting the day.
And so you could argue perhaps it kind of sets up the rest of the film because he's awake all night.
But it kicks off such a, once again, like you were talking about the tone of the 80s, because it's like everyone's playing their role, kind of, in this superficial kind of way, like where you wake up and you do it again.
Yeah, his wife
They-
certainly does.
Yeah. Yeah, like there's like a detachment almost, but then does she blurt out that she's having an affair? Sorry,
No,
I apologize for
I
my
believe
memory.
he it's the classic he forgot something and he comes home.
Yeah.
And so you had mentioned earlier screwball comedy, and so I feel like this is in some sense one of those Hollywood shorthands where you get your lover waiting around the block, and so as soon as the husband leaves for work, 2 minutes later, the guy pulls up in the Cadillac.
How could this go wrong?
Yeah, like he'll never turn around and come back for his lunch. It was that to me was like a very of an era.
Yeah.
kind of that. But that was his discovery. He saw the Cadillac at the curb.
Yes. And then went tearing in to find them together.
So you mentioned screwball comedy, and I'm curious, in your opinion, if this Michelle Pfeiffer character, who is it, Diana, I think it's her name, if she kind of qualifies in that same category as the Manic Pixie Dream Girl from Garden State with Natalie Portman, where they're a little bit like there's some they said they commit misdemeanors frequently, but never felonies. And they're kind of crazy, and they take this guy who is super uptight and they knock him out of his rut. So I was curious if you thought that, because I figure in the movie we talked about previously, there wasn't a strong female through line love interest. There are many, and they kind of served a little different roles. But here, what did you feel that her role, that character in the film?
Yeah, Lisa and I just talked
We
about
literally,
this
'cause we just watched
when we
this
just
movie.
watched this movie
Yeah.
again. I'll let you speak to it.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember what we said.
Well, what did you think?
I think there's some manic pixie dream girl, but I come back to that word nightmare, which I think we talked about last week. I mean, she's delightful, but she's also kind of a nightmare. So I guess I think of her more as like a nightmare dream girl in a way. Yeah, I'm not speaking to it very well.
She's-
what did we?
Yeah, I
what
mean,
did we
she's a
say
little
about this?
spacey,
Yeah.
and she's definitely more damaged goods
Yeah.
than your average manic pixie dream
Yeah.
girl.
I guess
but
I didn't-
I mean, there's
yeah.
there's definitely you could, if you were doing a manic pixie dream girl archaeological expedition, like this is definitely one of the skeletons
Right.
you would
Yeah.
unearth, right?
guess I
like
didn't-
she's an early unperfect
Right.
prototype.
She's
for
right.
that
I guess I
form,
didn't
yeah.
think she was 100% one because she is such a pain. Like she's really, I mean, she's getting him into trouble and she's always like, oh, just one more thing, just one more thing. That was one thing I noticed watching it this time around, that she's always like, can you just do one more thing for me? Just one more thing, just one more thing.
She's more in line with. I would look backwards before I would look forwards
that
to like
screwball
Garden State.
thing.
I would look more to like Carol Lombard,
Yes,
or like
yeah.
like Bringing Up Baby, or It Happened One Night, or
Yeah.
some of the more classic screwball comedies.
that
of
word
this-
screwball, I think, works
Yeah.
really well for her here. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think his character almost frustrated me more than like last week's Paul's character, because like you said, she kept asking him, so he had a moment where he could go, no, I'm going home.
Right.
I'm leaving.
Right.
And he kept kind of going. So it was just
one more
like,
thing.
Okay.
stop. You're just
But
continuing
I'm
your
actually
misery.
I'm going to disagree,
'Kay.
because we've established that he's an engineer, and we've also established that Michelle Pfeiffer is really hot looking. So his wife was stepping out on him.
Yeah.
I could see him a la Griffin Dunn's character in After Hours. He's chasing a little nookie, and he's going to do a lot to get there.
Well, and I'm going to be the dream girl again here by saying this is another one of those movies where there is that moment where he falls asleep at his desk and you're like, has he woken up, or is he? I mean, I think this movie is less surreal than last week's movie, so I
Right.
think in the end you come around it. But you do have that moment, I think, or I did, where I was like, is he still asleep?
Did everyone just clock that Lisa just called herself a dream girl?
Well,
Yeah.
I meant the girl who brings up the dreams all the time, which is
That's all right. You're my dream girl.
thanks.
So I do see that, though, because, I mean, first of all, they've established that he doesn't sleep much, so there's
Right.
that aspect of it.
Yep.
But I would argue that it is also a little bit surreal, but in kind of a different way. The Landis himself was one of the terrorists.
Yep.
And the way they're portrayed seems kind of more slapstick.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so that, to me, almost felt dreamlike in that it was kind of so ludicrous and over the top.
Yes.
So let's go big picture here for
Yeah.
a moment. So it's a movie about an insomniac who is very dissatisfied with his life and feels really adrift. And I think the key line from the first act of the movie, he's driving to work with his coworker Dan Aykroyd, and he turns to him and says, I don't know, I can't make sense of my life anymore. He's like, I feel like I'm an alien. Like he's outside of his own body. And so I think that explains the sort of dead-faced stare that Goldblum has through this whole movie.
Yes.
He really he's lost the ability to feel sensation. I think he's profoundly depressed. I mean, that's what depression is, right? It's numbness. And he has that numbness. And so the movie, the easier version of this movie that Landis could have made would be to introduce the manic pixie dream girl in the form of Michelle Pfeiffer, who's like in the middle of this convoluted diamond caper, which really doesn't even matter to the storyline, but is there to pull him into this kind of nightmare experience over the course of one long night, where he tangles with all of these colorful characters, David Bowie and Carl Perkins, and all these famous directors, and the four kind of Keystone Cops, Iranian villains that Mike was talking about, one of whom is the director of the movie. the easier version of that movie would have been like you would have seen him kind of come alive over the course of the movie, like rediscover life. But that's not exactly really what happens. Instead, he's kind of exasperated and not thrilled to be there, and trying to sort of disengage himself from what's going on through the course of the movie. He keeps saying, like, this is not me. I don't do this sort of thing. I have to go home, kind of like the guy we talked about last week in After Hours. I feel like it's a more interesting movie than the kind of the Hollywood version of it, which might be why it had such a really mixed reception when it came out. That and all the directors, which if you read the reviews from when this film came out, they're all negative, and the critics all pick on the same thing, which is that Landis cast all of these super famous filmmakers in all these small parts. There's like 30 or 40 really famous directors playing roles in this movie. And so the criticism at the time was this was just this narcissistic endeavor on Landis's part, and it's like a big Hollywood in-joke for him and his friends. And I feel like that's really unfair to the movie, because I think there's a lot more going on. I think he would have done himself a favor by not casting all those directors if those had just been regular actors or no-name actors. But they're there for a reason. They're obviously in there. They're in there for a practical reason, which is they're trying to show support to John Landis because he was going through something very terrible, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. But they're also there because there's a through line in this movie about the artifice of filmmaking itself. There's that whole long sequence where he goes to the set of the action movie, and he like breaks a fake wall. He falls into a fake rock. He tries to make a call on a fake telephone. And they're like, "What are you doing, buddy?" And they carry it away. So there's definitely like something. There's a self-reflexive quality to this movie that's really interesting, and that's also part of the movie's bigger comment on Los Angeles as a city. This movie's often paired with After Hours, the movie we talked about last week, in writing about in film criticism. It's considered like the West Coast version of After Hours. I would actually argue they're pretty different movies, but the basic plot structure is very similar, like the straight-laced yuppie who's pulled into kind of the nightmare experience by some beautiful blonde. Right?
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, I had read that the cameos were, and I don't know if he asked them to show support or they were like, hey, we want to show support, that they wanted to support him, that Hollywood was behind him after the tragedy on the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, so for your listeners that don't know, so John Landis directed one of the sequences in Twilight Zone, the movie, which was a movie with 4 little stories making up a feature film. And in the process of shooting that, an actor who shares my last name, Vic Morrow, and 2 children were killed in a helicopter crash on the set, and a lot of fingers were pointed at different people, including Landis, as to why the safety measures were not in place to prevent that accident. And the extremely rare occasion arose where they charged the director of the film with, I think, manslaughter.
Yeah, it was a criminal act.
Yeah, and of course, he was eventually found not guilty, but it was a very long, very public trial that took a very tough, as you might imagine, emotional toll on Landis. And I think he found out that he was charged, would be charged criminally 3 weeks before they started shooting Into the Night. And so you can only imagine, we talked about this last week with Scorsese, this is an even more dramatic version of that something really traumatic happened to Landis before he went in to direct what was otherwise, maybe on paper, probably looked like a pretty lightweight screwball comedy. Yeah. And instead now you watch it and it really is kind of nightmarish. It has a real edge. It has really graphic violence in it. And it just doesn't play like the movie you might think it would be if you were just reading the synopsis of it on paper.
Yeah.
Well, I felt like it really captured LA in the 80s, right? And so I did make a note that this is the winner in terms of bare breasts in this cycle. He definitely wanted to capture that at the end of his oeuvre. But just the whole bit where they go to Malibu and how this guy lives on the beach and all that, and the interaction with the highway patrol there on PCH, and then the downtown and everything. To me, it felt very much like somebody who lived in Hollywood making a movie about that. And I was curious if you thought that the favorite thing of movies about making movies, if that's more of a Hollywood than New York thing. Because I enjoyed that bit where he was on, like, that's what people would do. They would go on set and it'd be, oh, wow, I got to visit you on set. It's a big deal for the layperson in LA. So I'm curious if you thought that was a Hollywood thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an LA thing too. I lived in LA for a few years and worked in the film industry, and found myself very frustrated that I would never meet anybody who did something outside of the film industry. And at first I thought that must just be because that's my social circle, that I work in film, and so I'm going to meet other people in film. But I realized after being there a few years that that's not the case. It's just that if there are people in LA who do regular jobs, they also want to do film jobs. And so you just don't meet... Like, every once in a blue moon, I would meet, like, a nurse, and I would be like, oh, my God, you're a nurse? What is that like? What's it like to be a nurse? And it's one of the many reasons that I left it, because it felt like such an insular community, and it just got so uninteresting to me. More broadly, I just think this is the best of all the movies I've ever seen about LA. This is my favorite, because this movie really captures the feeling of LA at night, which is very different from any other city, which is more dense, right? Because LA is not a dense...
It's a sprawl.
It's a sprawl. And so it feels... LA, unlike every other major city I've ever been in at night, feels empty at night. And there are certainly neighborhoods that don't feel that way. Like Hollywood, there's always like tons of weirdos and streetwalkers and people out and about, but there are massive sprawls, parts of Los Angeles that just empty out at night, and he really captures that beautifully. And if you watch this movie, there are no like cars or people in the backgrounds of any of these shots. It's just it's an eerie feeling throughout the film. And I remember on a few times, one of my favorite things, actually, this is really weird, but one of my favorite things to do when I was living in LA, my friends and I would occasionally go down to Beverly Hills and Rodeo Drive in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. after drinking and partying and stuff, because it was just such a fun place to walk around at 2 in the morning, because it was dead empty, but all the lights were still on and everything was really sparkling and beautiful. But you wouldn't see another soul for miles. Wow. And he gets that in this movie. There's even scenes on Rodeo Drive, right? That's where he first encounters Bowie, David Bowie, yeah. And he goes to Century City. It's also just a great tour of Los Angeles, this movie. He goes to Marina Del Rey. He goes to Century City. He goes to West Hollywood. He goes to Hollywood. He goes to Beverly Hills. He starts in the Valley. So it's just a really great. You've named almost every
filming location I have.
Yeah. It's just such a great tour of the city, and
that's actually a really good point, because we talked about in After Hours how it would have been such a big deal for him to get home, but the actual as the crow flies distance is trivial. If you live in Los Angeles, that's like next door effectively. And I think if you haven't been down there, you don't understand the sheer scope, the distance, because there are very few multi-story buildings, right? The population density, even though there's a ton of people live in LA, but it's across a massive area. So everything is drive, right? Whether it's a highway or then a big boulevard like Sepulveda or something, you have to get in your car and drive long distances to get on there freeways that you couldn't possibly walk. Right. And I think that, and you mentioned that it's empty and that's why there are clusters, but I think for the most part, people, you drive in, drive out. And that's why I thought it was good to start with him in that car. They have a scene where they're in rush hour and it's this crappy little Toyota Corolla that was very small. People, I think, don't realize that cars have gotten bigger Even the compact cars got bigger. And then you put a big guy like Aykroyd next to him. And so just that comedy, kind of just the imagery of that to show that you're trapped in this car for an hour to go 8 miles, right?
Well, and what I love about that car scene is Jeff Goldblum doesn't fit in the car.
Right.
His hair is right up against it. And that also, I think, speaks to that, like, he doesn't fit in his life situation, unless I'm getting too symbolic here.
No,
but,
not
like,
at all. I think
he doesn't
that
fit.
car is a very
it's so important.
specific choice. And the way he shoots that car during later scenes, it's meant to look puny in the landscape of LA.
Yeah, and also just that whole, you and I have talked about this, that whole scene on the freeway where you're seeing other people's lives in their car, the woman crying and eating a sandwich, the dude looking at a magazine or whatever. People are living their lives in their cars and just like crawling along.
Right,
and that seems very LA to me. I've never lived in LA, but that seems very LA. That his little house under the freeway overpass. I love that because, again, not lived in LA, but that to me says, oh my gosh, we're in LA now. Like, but not in a Hollywood way.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest locations ever. He's got this tiny little bungalow house that literally is underneath an on-ramp.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, so there's that. And then the presence of the airport to me and the constant presence of the airport and airplanes, I think is interesting. I don't know if that's LA or not, but there's something really interesting about that to me, that it's ever present and kind of at the beginning and the end of the movie.
Well, he's driving to LAX to take a flight, but once he gets there, he doesn't get out of his car because he doesn't know where to go.
Yeah.
He doesn't know where to fly.
Yeah.
So it's like an empty gesture on his part, and that's when, of course, Michelle Pfeiffer literally drops into his life
out
by
of the
falling
sky.
onto his car.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I did, from a production standpoint, my question, I made a note of, how did they get that footage, the landing airplane footage, in 1985? There were no drones.
Yep.
So that to me is stunning. I don't know the answer, but I thought that struck out to me immediately. That's one of the things that I pick up on is, how did you do that?
Yeah, it was the first shot of the film.
Yeah.
Is this POV shot of the front of a 747 landing on the tarmac at LAX. It's so evocative when you mix it with that B.B. King score, it's just so beautiful, and it just sets the tone for the movie perfectly. I mean, this movie, to me, I get why people don't like it when I hear that some people don't like it. But for me, it's an absolute masterpiece of mood. The locations and the way it's lit. It's so beautifully lit. His use of color. That score is one of my favorite 80s movie scores. The weaving of B.B. King with that 80s synth stuff that he does. I think the casting is phenomenal. And I'm a big fan of when a movie can pull off tonal shifts, and I'm sure we'll talk about this when we get to Something Wild, for sure. A movie that starts out as one thing, and by the end of the movie, it's another kind of movie.
Yeah.
And that's really, really hard to do for a filmmaker, to start out one way and to start in one genre and somehow drift into another genre and have the whole thing feel organic. And maybe this movie doesn't do that as well as it doesn't do it as well as Something Wild. It's a little more jerky. Like from scene to scene, you might be in a slapstick comedy scene, and then the next scene's very beautiful and romantic, and then the next scene is almost from a horror film. So it pushes and pulls you all over the place, and I think that's why some people react negatively to this movie, or they don't get it. They don't understand they'll look at it and they're like, wait, is this supposed to be a romantic comedy? Because this is really bloody and really ugly occasionally.
Yeah.
Or really weird, almost avant-garde in some parts. And so, but that kind of unpredictability of it is one of the things that I've always gravitated to it for.
Well, I really think it starts in a mood that reminded me a little bit of Brazil, in that just kind of, he's just the drone in the system.
Very much.
Yeah.
All the cubicles, right? You're right. That feels very Terry Gilliam.
And they got accurate, the dialogue with when he's in the room and he's kind of falling asleep and they're like, oh, we need this. That was accurate dialogue. It really felt like he was in this mind-numbing meeting.
Yeah.
And so I thought, wow, that to capture that tone, again, I don't know what Landis did, but he talked to somebody, but he really captured what that, I think, was like. And there, you couldn't obviously feel it, but there's a sense of the oppressive heat to me. Was you're trapped in this room and everybody with their like short sleeve dress shirts and they just looked miserable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure none of us have ever been in meetings where we wanted to fall asleep,
not at all.
right? Yeah.
No.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, he just looks, for a tall scarecrow-looking guy, he looks so small in so many of it. The way it's shot is just so...
He's such an interesting choice for this movie. I kind of love him in this movie. But
Yeah, this was back when Goldblum
choice.
was actually an actor, before he started
Yeah.
just doing like variations on Goldblum eccentricity in every role. Like, this is a real performance. It's really interesting work he's doing. And Michelle Pfeiffer is amazing in
my
this
gosh.
movie.
Yeah.
I always forget how good she is.
Right.
Until
both
you
so good.
see some... And like Mike was saying, like, maybe the most beautiful woman in movies since Grace Kelly. Like,
She's very old Hollywood in
Oh,
this
yeah.
movie.
Yeah.
When
It's
we,
just-
yeah.
It's incredible. That's
she
what
was
we're...
a no-name. Like, they had to fight to cast her in this part. Like,
Can you
believe
she had
it?
only really
I know.
done Scarface and Grease 2 at that point. And so Landis, when they mentioned her to him, he had seen her on some failed TV show, and he was like, "Really?
Are you sure about
Like,
that?
In
yeah.
fact, I think it was the Animal House TV show. Hilarious.
Yeah, it was the
Oh,
Animal
nice.
House TV show.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was like, I don't think so. And then once he
Just
saw
meet
her
her. Just
lit,
meet her. They said.
he said once I saw a close up of her lit by my
Yeah.
DP, I was like, oh, I get it.
And so when you talk about people like bringing butts and seats, right? I think that's a case where I looked and immediately said, "Oh, that's it. That's that star quality." Right? There are a lot of pretty people. There are a lot of good actors, but there are some few who have that magic sparkle. I'm like, oh, okay, that's it. That'll end your film. So I could totally see that casting because, like you said, I thought this was like the first thing she'd done. I wasn't familiar with her work in Grease 2. Christy may have been, but I'm a Grease 1 person. That's all I've seen.
So have you read about this movie before you watched it, or did you watch
never
it cold?
Cold.
So did you pick up that you were seeing famous directors?
That's a really good question.
No.
No, not until I
didn't-
read it in the trivia.
So yeah, that's what I wonder. Like, again, that's, not to harp on this, but that's where I think critics can sometimes hurt a movie by bringing, the job of a critic in some ways is to bring some knowledge of film to help expand the audience's appreciation of that movie. But the flip side of that is if they have a knowledge of a movie, or they have knowledge of movies, like knowing what directors look like, then they can actually this is a case where the knowledge of the critics can actually hurt the movie.
Well, yeah, I was saying this the other day that when you told me that about the critics not liking that aspect of it, I thought, well, would the normal person who just went to see this movie even know? The only person I would have
Jim
recognized
Henson,
on
maybe?
myself would have been Jim Henson.
Right.
Other than that, I would I've watched it with you a few times, which is the reason I know who all these people are. But if I hadn't watched it with you, I wouldn't know. So I thought that was interesting.
And in the 80s, were directors as known? I mean, there were some,
Yeah,
obviously.
totally not.
Sure.
But
Absolutely not.
today,
Yeah.
your average film goer can rattle off
Might see that, might
10
know what they look
directors
like,
that
yeah.
and they know what they look
Yeah.
like, and they're celebrities, on their own.
And certainly, like, even if you knew their names back then, you wouldn't necessarily know what they look
they-
like.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Although in LA, would you? So is that like kind of an LA thing?
Well, that's that's the criticism, right? Is this a big kind of insiders joke? Like, is this movie made for 50 people, and those 50 people
Right.
are Landis's
Right.
friends?
Although to
Right.
your point, Dustin, I mean, that's what it's like to be in LA. It sounds like that almost
Yes.
grounds you more in LA because there's all these LA people in it, right? Although, again, the average moviegoer wouldn't know
Were you
that,
guys
but-
aware of the Landis criminal case? Did you know about the Twilight Zone tragedy?
I did, because
Oh,
I
well.
remember it. I remember.
I was down in LA when
Yeah.
that was
Oh,
going
wow.
on.
Oh, were you?
So
Yeah.
definitely, yeah, that was a
It was a big
huge deal,
news
that
story.
trial. So I don't think, obviously he could ever get away from it. That's always associated with him. When you talk about Landis, you think, oh yeah, the Twilight Zone.
So did you guys
they're
think
paired.
about that at all when you were watching this movie?
I didn't. No.
No.
And in fact, it was interesting. You're talking about critics, and so I used to watch the Siskel and Ebert show, but I actually kind of I don't always like trailers. I didn't want to know a lot about the film. The thing I really wanted for them was the thumbs up or thumbs down. And so what I think I look for is if you like a movie like this or that, you'll like this one. That's kind of when I'm going into it. I like to not know anything. I want to go in cold. I think that's fair to the filmmaker, right? And sometimes trailers or critics, they can spoil it when they talk about things that you don't, to me, I feel like you don't need to know. I want to go into it. And we just recently saw what I think is a very good film, A Good Person. Oh my gosh. and I was happy that I knew not a whole lot. I had seen the trailer, but I felt like that film worked better, and that if I had read a detailed review, it would have spoiled the film in a certain sense. And so I was happy that in this film, I didn't know until the trivia about the other directors, and I didn't really think about the trial and the timing of this until after I'd seen it.
And then you went, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it very much made sense. Like you were saying, the tone that and just what he would have been going through, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
Going.
It's one of the meanest spirited romantic comedies that you could see, I think. in this movie.
Well,
And that
there's a
bleeds
lot
through.
of killing.
Yeah, there is.
And fairly graphic, some of them. It's like I mean, in the parking structure, people really get blowed up.
Yeah.
So it's
the whole airport scene at the end. There's a lot of blood flying around.
Although,
in that
to me,
scene.
one of the even more brutal ones is when she gets drowned in the
when
ocean.
they drown
Like when
the
they're
woman in the
chasing her
you're
down
right.
in Malibu. They're in that house in Malibu,
Yeah.
and she runs out.
I mean, that's a perfect example
Yeah.
of the really swift tonal shifts that I was
Yeah,
talking
it's
about, because that
surreal.
scene starts out kind of hilarious
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the four guys are bumbling and they can't catch her and they're chasing her up and down the beach.
Right.
And they're like these weird yuppies that are sitting around eating
like,
lunch,
hey,
watching her.
what are they doing next door?
Yeah, but then like once they actually start to drown her in the ocean,
Yeah.
it turns really
I
dark.
kind of appreciate that. I think that scene's really interesting for that reason. It always strikes me every time we watch the movie.
Yeah.
It's really striking.
Well, yeah, it was such a twist, because it started out like many films in the 80s where you have the pretty girl running through the surf, and you're like, yeah, it's going to be slapstick. And like, oh, they actually killed her.
yeah.
You had that moment
the
like,
Keystone
wow,
criminals
ooh,
killed her.
geez.
Yeah. It's
And so it
something.
was that shift. And then there's the bit with the highway patrol officer where there's a limo and they talk their way
Yeah.
out of it. That to me also felt very LA.
Yeah.
That you could talk your way out of this, like, oh, okay, yeah, all right,
Right.
good to see you, sir, and go about your way.
Right.
I
So,
love that scene. The
Yeah, it's a
phone
good-
number she gives. she's like,
it's 1, 2,
he's like, what's your
3,
phone number?
4,
It's
5, 6,
1, 2,
7.
3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, it's so good. So good.
Oh god.
Not even a
This movie
555.
has I just want to point this out too, because it's just, this movie has one of, if not my favorite, single shots in all of film.
Oh, yes.
Which is the shot where Diana, the Michelle Pfeiffer character, has just leapt onto his car and they're fleeing the airport because they're being chased by these diamond smugglers. And his little car, his little pathetic, whatever it is, Toyota,
Yeah.
drives underneath a bridge, which I remember this bridge. LAX has this very strange layout where when you're on your way to the airport, you go underneath this, you go in this little tunnel and you're underneath a runway, an active runway. And so there's a shot where his puny little car is driving under this bridge and you see this giant 747 above it, just looming above it. And it's just, there's just so much like thematic material packed into that shot.
Right.
I sound like such a film geek, but like seeing shots like that is where I just like, I get so giddy, because it's also just this beautifully lit
Yeah, it is
shot.
beautifully
It's
lit.
beautifully framed.
Well, and he would have had to time that very
yes.
precisely.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think you've talked to me about how he even had to do that.
I can't remember. It
Yeah.
might even have been like a second unit shot for all I know, because there's
Or someone
there are
had to
no
time it, yeah.
big names in that. The actors, you can't see them in the shot. but
Right.
yeah, it's just such a great shot.
great
The movie is full of those. It's a beautiful movie, and the use of Bowie is great. Bowie's
He would
great
have been
in this movie.
recognizable. People
Yeah, well,
would
yeah,
have.
you would recognize Bowie.
'Cause he was huge.
The fight, the whole sequence where he goes up to that empty
Yes, I
hotel
love that
suite
so much.
and he's
Oh.
looking around and
It's so creepy.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Bowie's in there, and then Bowie has a knife fight with Carl Perkins.
I-
of all people.
yeah.
And he's got all those TVs going with
Yeah.
Abbott and
Abbott and
Costello
Costello,
on
yeah.
them, and the framing of that shot where Bowie's trying to stab Carl Perkins,
Yeah.
and then the knife is in front of the television,
Yeah.
and it looks like Bud Abbott is reacting to the knife.
Right.
Like there's just there's like so many interesting compositions, and I feel like there's a lot of criticism of Landis for being this very commercial. He makes a lot of very broad comedies, and he does do a lot of really self-indulgent filmmaking. There's a lot of like ridiculous car chases in his movie. The whole last act of the Blues Brothers is basically like Landis playing with Matchbox cars in Chicago.
Hal Needham, right? I think was the the stunt guy there.
Yeah. I think he's underrated, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think he's a really, regardless of what you might think of him personally, I think he's a more interesting filmmaker than people give him credit for.
I love that hotel scene. There's like this real creepy 80s opulence about it. Huge horse statues and like the food that's all been prepared, but nobody's around. I just love when he's walking through that hotel room and there's nobody there. It seems like everyone just vanished. I don't know. I just love that. I think it's great.
Yeah, and I think too, leaving the TVs on was more of an 80s thing as background noise. And I made a note, and I don't have really good evidence, but I felt like they were slightly out of sync. The Abbott and Costello bit was the audio or that something was slightly out of sync, which again, maybe that was just coincidence with the way it got edited together. But that was something I noticed, and it made it discordant, and that's kind of what I thought. And then it was strangely like the lighting of that whole set was odd. I couldn't figure out if it was practically lit or what. And then I remember drapes and stuff. It was just very 80s. Very.
Yeah, I have that more than once. Very classic 80s hair and clothing, and then the soundtrack, like you mentioned. Just to kind of geek out on sound, I liked when he catches his wife. I believe it goes silent, but then we hear breathing, and I think it's his breathing. Yeah. So he's seeing, and obviously he could hear what was going on, but it just cuts silent, and now we just hear his breathing, which I just think is great. And then when the waitress drops the sugar, it sounds like a gunshot more than, And so
Amy Heckerling, the director of Fast Times at Ridgemont High and any other classic, Clueless, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
that's
I like
really
those sound choices. Yeah.
It's a fun movie to watch a second time if you just to spot there is some fun in spotting all these filmmakers. I mean, there are like 40 of the greatest directors of all time are playing small parts in this movie. It's really
they had to be willing. I mean, because they all did it as a favor. So it wasn't like he said, you're going to be here. They were offering up their time to show support for him.
Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I like that.
Did you like it? It's an incredibly... It's okay if you don't. I mean, it's a cult movie, and cult movies are divisive by definition. So
I think of the four, this was... I think this was my least favorite.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. Huh. That's probably my favorite. I liked it.
Was it the shifts?
Well,
the weird tonal shifts?
I don't know if I'm going to put this in the... I am not remembering any of it. Like when you guys talked about her drowning, I was like, oh yeah, I remember them drowning her. And then I don't even remember the knife scene, but in my notes it said the knife in the foreground over the TVs in the background. So obviously I watched this movie, but I have no memory.
Just didn't stick with you, yeah.
And so that's why I'm like, oh yeah, I'm glad you guys are all talking.
You were an insomniac and you couldn't remember it.
I remember her brothers, and I couldn't figure out where to fit this in. I remember her brother's
oh god, the
room,
Elvis,
the Elvis room.
We didn't even talk about that. That was I love that. That's so amazing.
Right. Yeah, and the car.
Oh my god.
They take the brother's car.
I love the car so much. What does it say on the side?
The king lives.
The king lives.
The king lives on the side
I
of it.
love that car. Oh.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess this wasn't.
Just didn't make an impression, maybe.
I was like, did I leave the room? But then as you guys are talking, I'm like, no, I have notes, so I didn't leave the room.
I did like it. I was surprised when I don't remember until we started talking. I'm like, oh yeah, I really did like this film, and I don't know if it's because I have a hard time sleeping, so that I responded to that character.
Yeah, me too.
Like I said, I was surprised at Michelle Pfeiffer because she was so kind of just such a starlet that like, again, I feel bad saying that, but I was stunned by it. I was like, oh my gosh, this is. So there was that part of it. There were a ton of cars involved. Obviously, Landis is a car guy, which again comes back to LA, that your car is such a part of your identity.
House.
That unlike I think any other place in the US, but probably not New York City. And I was trying to think of an example, like your watch or something. No, it's different. It's a thing all of itself, but it very much that depicts, and you talked about how Goldblum starts in that little tiny thing, and he goes to these expansive cars and these more expensive cars, and you can see there's kind of an arc there as well.
Yeah,
Car
totally
art.
right.
That's so interesting. I didn't think
even
about
thought
that.
about that, but you're totally right. Like he's
Yeah.
in a Ferrari by the end of the
By the end of the film.
That's true.
Which, again, in LA, that's, in some
Yeah.
sense, you're judged by your car.
Yeah.
Some people sometimes have a better car than where they live because you're out and about, and so that's how you
'Cause it
can
is your
show
house.
your
It's a
status.
status
and then
symbol,
you
yeah.
go home to Inglewood, and you
Yeah,
take your
or
Ferrari
whatever.
back.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
wow.
very much so. Yeah, people can be, I guess, car poor, right? They spend a ton on their car. So I thought that was an interesting part. But I was really surprised. I did like this film, even though, like you said, the diamond plot line, that was kind of like the briefcase that lights up. It's
a
just a
MacGuffin,
MacGuffin. Who cares? But it's there to kind of drive the plot along. I also thought it was interesting. It maybe doesn't play as well now, but the way they made the Iranian terrorists, that was a little bit broadly drawn, a little stereotypical, which at the time no one, I don't think, probably would have, maybe except for the people from Iran, would have blinked at that. But that was one thing that I saw. I was like, oh, wow. Like, that was an interesting choice.
Yeah.
You could never get away with it today.
Although I think that
and
was more
it's-
about Keystone Cops for him than it was about.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
if you've seen the Blues Brothers or a lot of Landis comedies, there's like an absurd level of slapstick in them. Like, and he designs set pieces around slapstick again, like the big car chase at the end of the Blues, where they're going to the mall. And
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
Sight gags galore,
Yeah.
right? And it's part of that, and they're weird because they are really dangerous. They're responsible for some pretty bloody deaths in the movie, but they're also a total joke.
Right,
Yeah,
there's a
it's
part
interesting.
where Landis himself turns his gun around, uses a hammer to break up
like a walnut, I think. He's
Yeah,
just, like,
some
crushing a
confection
walnut.
of some
Yeah. Oh,
sort.
right, yeah.
It was so bizarre.
Yeah.
But that,
You're right.
and they're just sitting in the background, and it almost reminded me of like the See No Evil Monkeys, the three of them on the couch, and it was very much that was silly.
Yeah. Striking.
So that kind of lends us. Was there any head trauma in this?
I
Serious head trauma.
Yeah.
Diana falls on the hood of his car.
Yes.
And she takes a pretty good header. And then the other one I noted was the poor actress Christy, what her character is called, was accosted in the surf by the Iranians. There is some head trauma there.
Well, and a guy shoots himself in the head at the end of the movie.
Okay, that counts as trauma. Yeah, I was
yeah,
more thinking
clearly.
blunt trauma, but you're right. That is head trauma.
I would consider that pretty traumatic.
Very traumatic, yes.
Any smoochies?
Smoochie, smoochy, smoochy.
Here, I'll do it. Smoochie, smoochie.
At 56:45, Diana gives Ed a peck when she's saying goodbye. That's all I've got on
Okay.
that one.
That's so, these movies, I wasn't paying any attention to kissing. There's like no kissing in this movie. That's so interesting.
Very little.
Yeah.
Yeah, just that one
Just the
peck
one.
that I made note of. I do sometimes miss them because I get caught up in the film.
Right.
And then I've heard, but give us a comprehensive driving review.
Oh, there's quite a bit here. Starting out, the 1984 Toyota Corolla is about as boring as you can possibly get. It's beige, it's small. It was, at the time, Toyota was pushing their, but it's economical, kind of very boring vehicle. And that sets up, and then you see the contrast when his wife's Amour shows up. He's driving a Cadillac Seville, and it's blue. It's got color. So you immediately can see that difference between there. I thought it was interesting that the kidnappers used a silver Mercedes-Benz 500 SEL. That's a pretty high-end car for kidnapping. Like, normally you want something you can ditch. So I don't know what they were talking about that.
They are diamond smugglers.
That's true.
Right?
Maybe
So
it
they're
wasn't a throwaway
well-heeled
car,
kidnappers.
yeah.
I did mention that there was stunt driving by Goldblum. There's some shots where he was obviously driving, and there's no way you could have faked it, which is amazing. They also have this 59 Cadillac Eldorado, which is the Elvis
That
mobile.
the King Lives one.
Yeah, and I thought, isn't that interesting? Because it's almost the exact opposite of the Corolla. It's one of the largest cars ever made, right? And it's open. It's a convertible. So instead of having him pinned under the roof, now
that's
it's
a good
just
point.
this expansive
Yeah.
open thing, which is an interesting. The Corvette, says sleazy producer, better than almost anything. That was a great storytelling in and of itself. And then the last little bit I mentioned was he upgrades to the Ferrari. by the end of the film, and that was also showing, I thought, that progression of his character, in particular in L.A., right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right.
There's a real... I really never thought about the storytelling through cars in this movie, but it's really there.
Yep.
This is not really about cars, but I did love that moment when they're going to get the Ferrari and the fancy cars from her sugar daddy, essentially, and she asks for the wife's car because the wife really doesn't like Michelle Pfeiffer's character, and she's like, "Which car is the wife's car?" She takes it. I thought that was funny.
The wife was the great Vera Miles from Psycho.
And the husband was Richard Farnsworth.
And, Richard Farnsworth played Jack. There are a lot of great old Hollywood actors in small parts in this movie, too.
Shall we go to the numbers?
Let's go to the numbers.
I could not find a budget for this film. So in my normal websites where I find budget, I couldn't find it. But it did make $6.7 million worldwide. It got a 6.4 out of 10 on IMDb. Critics put it at 40%. That seems really low.
That does seem low.
I think, well, again...
Well, like you were saying.
Yeah, the assessment at the time was a little unfair, I think. He was also on trial for manslaughter, and there are a lot of critics that just don't like the types of movies he makes. Like, they're not going to like broad comedies, and I think there was a lot of animosity, might be too strong a word, but there was some ill will toward Landis among critical circles at the time, and this is an easy movie to take it out on him because it's such an odd movie.
Right. Audiences liked it better at 49%, almost halfway. It's just under 2 hours at 1 hour and 55 minutes, and it's listed as an action crime comedy. Once again, I guess crime.
I guess murder qualifies as a crime.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Mm-hmm.
And Diamond
I'd call it a
Emerald
mood
Heist.
piece.
It
has to be
very
an
mood
R.
piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd think so.
I mean, I'll say that that's, I think, the hardest thing, one of the hardest things you can do as a filmmaker is to create a mood with your movie, because that takes a holistic point of view where you're thinking about how will my cinematography and my music work together? How will my casting and my locations and my cars, how will these things play off? How will the light...
The light is,
you know, even if you've listened to us talk about this for the last half hour and thought, I'll never watch this movie, I implore you to watch the first 5 minutes, just because the first 5 minutes of this movie are one of, I think, the great kind of evocations of mood that has ever been put on film.
Definitely.
It's this, you hear this beautiful B.B. King score. There's this great shot that Mike was talking about that starts at the airport, and then his camera just floats through nocturnal LA, and you see all of these beautiful nocturnal LA locations, and it's almost haunted. It's just so ghostly and so beautiful.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of moments in the film that are haunted too, in a good way to me.
Yeah, it's a great portrait of a city. Yeah.
It was rated R. It's a Universal Pictures, and John Landis won the special jury prize at the Cognac Film Festival. Cognac Festival du Film Policier.
Okay.
Maybe a festival where everybody's drinking and
Yay, give it to
That's
him.
probably a good way to get good ratings, is get them lit.
Yeah, definitely check this movie out. I think you guys have given him a lot of reason to. I mean, I want to almost watch it again since I'm having trouble with my memory.
I will say it's a movie that really, really rewards repeat viewing because I have seen it several dozen times and I still find new things in it. And there are things that like I never thought about what Mike just said, the whole tracking the narrative through cars.
Yep. He's
totally right.
Yep.
Like there are so many things going on in this movie that I think you're not going to see if you're just watching it as a screwball comedy.
Totally agreed. I've seen it a few times now, and I'm seeing new things all the time. So
next week we are going to be talking about something wild, and definitely listen to last week's episode because you will be able to grab that clue, or you'll grab the answer of what the theme of the month is, and join us next week. And never forget,
Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies.
Thanks for listening to Dodge Movie Podcast with Christy and Mike Dodge of Dodge Media Productions. To find out more about this podcast and what we do, go to dodgemediaproductions.com. Subscribe, share, leave a comment, and tell us what we should watch next. Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies.